Okay, it's about a minute or two after 7. I think the live stream should be all going and started. So we are going to get tonight's session rolling. So first off, I just want to welcome everybody to tonight's session. You are joined in on the Oro-Medonte Council Composition and Ward Boundary Review session. We're doing some public information sessions to get the word out about the project, present some preliminary options to the public, and get some feedback. My name is Jack Amendolia. I'm a managing partner with a firm called Watson & Associates. We're based out of Mississauga, do a lot of work for municipalities and school boards, mainly throughout Ontario, but throughout Canada as well. I'm joined tonight by my colleague at Watson, Josh Valenti. Josh is a consultant at Watson and works primarily in education, growth management, and ward boundary fields. His expertise is in population forecasting, understanding how places are going to settle both today and in the future. And a lot of that work is based in Josh's skills with geographic information systems. And that's where Watson plays a large role in these ward boundary reviews, is really on that technical side. Like I said, understanding how places are going to grow, how many units are going to be built, how much population that's going to produce, and ultimately how that's going to impact your wards, both today and in the future. We've heard the term representation by population. That's an important component of this study, trying to ensure that the wards have somewhat equal populations amongst each other. However, as we hope that you're going to learn through tonight's session and throughout this process, that it's not only about population and population parity, but there are other guiding principles or core principles that we use throughout this study to help us also design a good ward system. And to that end, we've had a long-standing relationship with Dr. Robert Williams, who you see on your screen. I'm going to refer to him tonight more informally as Bob. Bob and Watson have been working together for well over a decade, and Bob is a retired professor from the University of Waterloo, specialty in political science. And post-retirement, Bob's second career, so to speak, has been helping municipalities throughout Ontario with these types of reviews. Bob's skills lie in municipal governance, electoral systems, municipal affairs, and those skills really help us understand the other guiding principles, communities of interest, ensuring that the lines that we use and the boundaries that we use are clear and identifiable, and trying to mesh all of those other guiding principles with representation by population to hopefully provide a system that gives effective representation. And we'll provide some more detail into what some of these terms mean as we go through tonight's session. A couple of things we're going to do tonight. So we have some participants on the call involved in the Zoom meeting, and we have other participants that are viewing through the live feed. The participants that are on the Zoom call tonight will have a chance to interact with us and ask us questions and provide comments. There's a couple of ways we can do that. If you look on the bottom of your screen, some icons will come up. You can either hit one of the reaction icons and we'll know that you want to ask us a question, and you could unmute yourself and turn the video on and ask us verbally. If you want to type something in the chat, you can do it that way, and we'll be moderating that throughout the night. If you want to ask a question verbally, we just ask that you wait until after the presentation when we have some time for feedback a little bit later. If you want to chat and ask a question, you can do so anytime throughout the night. If you're someone who's watching on the live stream and you think, oh, I got something I really want to comment on or ask them, jump on your computer and go to the oromedonte.ca/WR website, and you can find links there to come and join the Zoom meeting and interact with us that way. A little bit of housekeeping before we move on. So just as I was talking, when we watch the presentation, we just ask that you leave your video off and you stay muted. And as I mentioned, then we can unmute yourselves once the presentation is done. In terms of what we're going to do next, so in a couple of minutes, we will play a pre-recorded presentation that Bob and I put together for you. set the table for us a little bit tonight, provide a little bit of context, a little bit of background as to what we are trying to do through this study, a little bit about the process and methodology, so that when we present the preliminary options, you have a little bit of information, a little bit of understanding about what we tried to do. Once that presentation's over, we will come back live and we will walk through and present the preliminary option, ward boundary options that we've come up with. And then, like I was saying, we can give participants on the call, if they so choose, some time to ask questions and provide feedback. Session typically about an hour, hour and a half, depending on how the discussion goes. So we have lots of time to get everything in tonight. So sit back. We are going to start up the presentation in a minute. I hope you enjoyed. I think it's about 30, 35 minutes. And like I was saying, we'll be back and speaking to you again shortly. Thanks very much for your time, for your attention, and for your interest in the project. Talk to you soon. I'm going to start out by going through the presentation. A couple of things that we're going to go through if we move to the next slide in the presentation. So like I said, we're going to talk about the legislation a little bit, the framework, the process, ultimately what the outcome of this ward boundary review is. An important component of these reviews is the public engagement, and part of what we're doing tonight, making sure that the public is aware of what we're doing, and also ensuring that we're hearing the viewpoint and perspectives of the public as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that process looks like and what we've heard so far. And then ultimately the best part, I think, of tonight and why people are here, to look at what those preliminary ward boundary options are actually going to be. So quickly, if we move on to the next slide, this was a two-phase process. So we're now in the second phase of this process. In phase one, we did very similar things that we're doing in phase two. We had reports, we had public engagement, we had these information sessions, we had a survey that we'll talk about a little bit later. But it was really the focus of phase one was education, was information. The consultant team brings best practices, experiences to this process, but what's very important for us is to learn about the uniqueness of Oro-Medonte. While we can bring experiences from other places, they are a lot more viable and they make a lot more sense when we can apply those experiences to the characteristics of your municipality. So that was really phase one. However, phase two, we get a little bit more technical, where we start dealing with the population forecasting and modeling that I spoke about a couple of minutes ago. And we get into the actual development of preliminary options that we're going to present to you tonight. And you see those second and third bubbles are highlighted in yellow right now. That's because that's where we're at in the process now. We've developed those options. We're presenting them to the public. Ultimately, after we garner feedback and finish this stage of the process, we will develop a final ward boundary report and council composition options and present that to your council in July. So at this part of the presentation, I'm going to pass things over to Bob, and he's going to walk you through some of that context and legislative framework I introduced. Bob?
Thank you, Jack. Now, I'm not sure if I'm the only one, but I can't see the slides. So I'll just work with what I've got here in front of me. So, okay. Anyway, the context is important. Oro-Medonte, of course, is an amalgamated municipality created in 1994 as part of the reorganization in Simcoe County, primarily the two townships of Oro and Medonte, with parts of a number of other municipalities joined together in this new municipality. At that time, the population was just under 17,000 people. So in 2021, or roughly in 2019, the population was estimated at about 22,000. So there's been some growth over that time, not spread evenly across the municipality, but nevertheless some growth. The structure of the council is the same today as it was in 1994. That is, there's a mayor and a deputy mayor, both elected at large, that is across the whole municipality, and they together represent the township on Simcoe County Council. There are also 5 local councilors, so the total council is 7 members, 5 local councilors elected in 5 wards. Part of our direction is to look partly at the population today, but also to think forward roughly 10 years to 2031. There'll be three municipal elections between now and then. And by that time, the population, currently around 22,000, is expected to be 30,000. So, again, significant growth. And part of what we need to look at is how that's accommodated in this electoral system with the two at large positions and the five ward councillors. So, what are the powers? Jack made a reference to this a few minutes ago. There is a legislative framework here that drives this. Council can do certain things, but it can't do others. And one of the remarkable things I realized when I started doing this work is that the Ontario Municipal Act really doesn't tell us very much. It doesn't say much about how this is done or what kinds of things to take into account. The basic parts are there in the box on the left. Municipality can change the size of the council. That's implicit in the title of this review. The legislation refers to the composition of council. So a council composition review would consider how big should the council be. Currently seven, should it change? The legislation also says that the municipality can determine how that council can be elected, except for the mayor. Every mayor in Ontario must be elected at large. After that, it's open to the local council to decide whether you're going to have wards or not, whether you're going to elect other officers at large, how many wards, whatever. Those kinds of questions are there. And the third bullet there is component of the second component of our review. Council has the power to divide or redivide the municipality into wards or to dissolve the existing wards. So it's basically how are those members of council going to be elected? Council itself has the authority to do that. As we'll see in a moment, part of our job here is to provide advice on doing that. So the other box basically is what I alluded to before. There's no schedule for this. Your boundaries have been in place since 1994. Other places have had systems that are changed much more frequently, and or in other cases, we're dealing with another municipality hasn't looked at the boundaries in 40 years. So there's no schedule, there's no obligation. So and there's no process to follow. Again, we are bringing a process to this that we will talk a little bit about, and Jack's already alluded to that. And there's no criteria to use to say what's a good system, how would you reform it, what kinds of things would you want to come out the other end. Again, part of that is what we're bringing into this review. So as the first bullet points out, each municipality must set its own terms of reference, its own parameters, establish guiding principles for the wards, and we'll see how that is integrated into the review in Oro-Medonte. And the last part is that the review is typically framed around established procedures and principles. We don't borrow a lot, but we pay attention to how things are done elsewhere, and we've adapted that to the circumstances in a municipality like Oro-Medonte and how other municipalities have organized their council. And we also know that in the past, these decisions were made by the Ontario Municipal Board, now called the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal. Many of those decisions are important in helping us work out what a good system looks like and what kinds of things we need to be taking into account. I think I'm still doing the next one, right? So the primary purpose, and this slide will point out something we've just alluded to. The primary purpose of the study is to prepare Oro-Medonte Council to make decisions on whether to maintain the existing electoral structure or to adopt an alternative arrangement. So the key part there is that it's council that makes decision. We don't. We offer insights. We hope some evaluation. We provide some alternatives. Council gets to make the choice. Our role is to provide them with the kind of information they need to make a decision about what the municipal council should look like ahead of the 2022 election. So the process that we are following, we had set that out, as I said, when we started. We're in a phase, the second part of this, where we're doing preliminary boundaries. population forecasting, data modeling go on all the time, but that's a key starting point for both our evaluation of the current system and our thinking about what alternatives might be appropriate. So that part has been going on. We're now at the development of preliminary ward boundary options. And the word preliminary is important because these are, if you will, a starting point. We've applied what we've learned and what we've been able to bring to the evaluation. The next part will be to ask you in that third bullet, you, the community, to help us understand what we've got right, what we've got wrong, what's promising, what's not workable. Those are the things that the community itself must contribute to what we're doing. The final part will be develop some final options for council to make that decision, and that will come fairly soon after we've had a chance to do this review and final discussions with you and the community and council. I'll go over now to Jack.
Thanks, Bob. Josh, if we can just go one slide back for 1 second, I just want to address some of those questions. So we talk about in the early part of our review and in the first phase, we asked some questions, and basically we wanted to get an idea of how well does the present electoral structure serve the residents of Oro-Medonte? Does that electoral structure provide fair and effective representation? And would an alternative system provide better representation? And we kind of joke in the first round that if the answer to the first two questions was yes, then there's not much left for the consultant team to do, and we kind of pack our bags up and go home. However, if we find that the questions from those first two questions are no, then we do have to start to evaluate whether an alternative system would make more sense. So we really want to get into this next phase and start to answer those questions. So that's really, like I said, what the focus is on phase two. When we move to the next slide, there's some things that Bob already touched on that we do to try to make that second phase successful. So in the first phase, I talk about the awareness and education, and things that we did to do that were interviews with council, interviews with senior staff, and the municipality has a senior team that we've worked collaboratively with from the beginning of this process. And like I said, really for the consultant team to have that local knowledge available to them. All of these sessions, all of the engagement, all of what we heard in the survey in the first round is really getting to the point that helps us inform these preliminary options. Again, really quickly, some high level perspectives of that first phase. When we look at the survey, we had about 200 people that participated in the survey. Almost 150 of those 200 people answered the key questions. So that just means that not everyone answers every single question in the survey, but in this case, we had really good participation and good response rate of those questions. About 60% of our respondents lived in Ward 1, so a little bit weighted towards 1, but again, about 30% of the population in the town, in the township comes from that ward as well, and a pretty active ward from what we hear from respondents and from staff as well. So that's just a little bit of what we did in phase one, like we said, to start to help us inform where we're at now. So I'm going to pass things back over to Bob. He's going to talk to you a little bit about exactly what we heard from clients or from constituents, and then get into the evaluation of that phase one that, like I said, leads us into coming up with some of these preliminary options. Bob, back to you.
Thank you, Jack. Now, these are very general overview sketches of what we heard, but there were 4 areas that we're highlighting here. And these are important to what we've tried to do in coming up with preliminary options and in what we would want to see going forward. First of all, for many respondents, put a high priority on the equal representation by population principle. Population parity was an important part, and it features in the approaches that we take here because it is a fairly important one. Fewer people, though, put the idea of a community of interest at the top of the list. It's important. About a quarter of the respondents said the wards should capture community of interest very well. But also there were other responses a little lower that talk about future growth as opposed to the present population, and others about about geographical features. These are probably less important, but we take that to mean you need to have wards that are easy to identify, and there are some issues with the current boundaries in that sort. We also ask a very broad question. Many people can interpret it. People could interpret it in many different ways, but asking people whether they felt the current wards represented them effectively, properly, clearly. Um, and about 57% said no, they didn't. The wards were not what they thought were a suitable arrangement. Um, and about 43% said they were happy with that. And there are there'll be some information about whether that's distributed evenly across the municipality, but it certainly tells us that many people have some issues about the way the wards are currently set up. The third box talks about this question of council composition. Just over half of the respondents felt that the council is fine at the size that it is. And there are a number of reasons why people would come to that conclusion. Uh, but there was a significant proportion, just over a third, who thought that there should be more counselors. And this is part of the dilemma of trying to fit everyone into 5 wards and meet the other principles. But only about 10% thought there should be fewer. So that's a bit of a wash. We're happy where we are, and the other views were split. So we don't see an overwhelming sense that the size needs to change. Beyond that, there were other comments, not as extensive as we might on the others, but talking about concerns over the representation of certain smaller communities within Oro-Medonte. How well are they represented? And without getting into too many specifics, a number of times these would be, for example, references to Moonstone, which is a self-contained self-contained settlement in the northern part of the township, separated by the major component of its ward, and feeling that perhaps they get overlooked in that, and bits of that in some of the other cases. So again, it's part of that community of interest perspective that we heard from from some of the other respondents. So, what did we determine in phase one? That slide that follows, slide 10, uh, gives us some sense of what we took away from the assessment of the present ward system. Some of it, as we've suggested earlier, from our own analysis, our own study of the components of the municipality, population distribution, history, things of that sort. Part of it from the interviews we conducted with present and past members of council, with staff, and of course from the responses of residents in the municipality. So we try to work from the present system, because if the question is, do you keep it or not, you need to know, is that the overwhelming view to keep it? Or do you say, well, let's keep these things and fix those other parts, because we don't blow it up and start over again. We try to adapt it if that's the case, because that's often an easier direction for people to go. So we're asking ourselves these questions. Is it equitable? Do people have effective representation within the structure as it's set up? The current system poses some dilemmas for us. When we look at 2 or 3 key features, the population is not spread evenly throughout the township, which means there are population disparities between the wards, and particularly Ward 1, which is much higher than we would call our optimal range. If there are 5 wards, they should all be roughly 20% of the population. We discovered that in fact Ward 1 is close to 30%. So that's an issue right there, fixing the population. The other, the second bullet is a theme we've touched on already. The projections indicate that the population could be over 30,000 by 2031, and that in fact much of the growth is going to happen in the in that Ward 1 area, or in areas that are already large. So, if you will, the growth is not going to correct things. The growth is not going to tilt things back and say we're good. It will in fact only get worse. So, given that future growth is one of the things we need to think about, then we want to try to accommodate that. And then finally, and this is the same point in a slightly different way, there's considerable residential development in the Horseshoe Valley community and the immediate areas, but there are also important rural communities, lakeside communities, others that have a unique history and a distinct identity that we believe should be captured in award system. So it's not just put the numbers up there, divide it up into an equal part and not really care where the lines go. We've got to build it around the history and the fabric, if you will, of Oro-Medonte as it's been as it's been operating since 1994. The next slide is a visual rather, representation of some of those same points. There is a population disparity. The chart on the left shows us not just the present in the blue lines, but in the growth in the orange ones, so that the largest ward becomes even larger. The smaller wards don't become smaller, but we notice that Ward 2 virtually doesn't change. So in relation to the other, its position may change. And in the chart on the right again is that picture. Ideally, those would be 5 equal parts of that circle, and we see that there is this distinction, wards running from 15% of the population to 31%. Okay, optimal population. Am I going to you on this one, Jack, or am I finished? Am I still going on that?
Still
Okay,
you, Bob.
I'll go with it. All right. And we talked about this a few minutes ago, and I'll just walk through it very quickly. And when we look at the reports and the figures that we're going to be showing you, there are some colors coded boxes, if you will, a chart with these colors in them. And they're a simple way of capturing the way that population is distributed. And the green band in the middle of this um, chart is the ideal. If we could end up with a system in which 5 wards were all in that green box, it would be, well, it would be a miracle probably because that almost never happens. But that's the goal, get as many as we can into that range, which is what we call the optimal range. A target in 2021 of 5,198 people or 6,094 in 2031, within 5% of that. Those would be wards that are optimal. The further away you move, the darker the color into the red. And our hope is that we don't have wards in those bright red categories because those are greater than 25% away from that optimal size. Sometimes that happens, and we can talk a bit about why that might occur. But this is a quick way of summarizing. The goal is to get to that line in the center, and we can accept the ones on either side, up to 25%. We try to avoid the ones beyond that. Occasionally, we have to see that happen, but that's because we've got other principles involved. Okay, so last thing for me here, the existing wards. Many of you on the call will be quite familiar with what this looks like, and the color codes there are picked up in those earlier slides. And again, we see certain characteristics to the outsider, and maybe to many in the township, are striking. The first, of course, is the actual geographic size, the area of Ward 1. And we've already suggested that's the biggest population. Well, it's also the biggest area. It's a large area, but of course, in the center of it, or cutting across the middle of it, is Highway 400. Is this really one place or is it 2 places? The current Ward 3 runs all the way from Craighurst down to Shanty Bay. It's quite a mix of communities, especially that rural area in the middle, but it's got 2 anchors, if you will, one at the north, one at the south. On the eastern side of the municipality, much of the growth is toward the edges, if you will, whether it be Warminster in the north or the communities closer to the lake down along the Ridge Road or even on Highway 11. So when we look at it, we can see some interesting features, but they don't necessarily all contribute to a good system. And there's a couple other things I'll mention when we come back to talk about preliminary options. Over to Jack.
Thanks, Bob. So thanks for that evaluation, because I think it really hits home in terms of the things that we try to look at, not only in terms of the existing system and how we evaluate that, but everything that Bob talked about, we then carry forward to evaluate our preliminary options as well. So ultimately, where we're at now is we ask one of the bigger questions: Do the that I talked about earlier? Do the wards need to be changed? And I think after you listen to what Bob spoke about, our answer is yes. Again, we don't think this is not a ward system or electoral system that is completely malfunctioning or completely broken. We definitely see a lot worse in our work, but I think what we've pointed out were definitely some issues and some tensions with the existing system that we think by looking at some alternative designs could probably be fixed or at least addressed. So we do think that it's worthwhile to consider some preliminary options. We do think that a better effective representation might be achieved, at least in terms of evaluating that against the core principles we spoke about tonight. So basically, what we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes when we start to show you the preliminary options is what we want to, or just now before we get into that, we just want to be sure in terms of some of the things we looked at when we came up with those preliminary options. So obviously public engagement and speaking to council and speaking to town staff all come into the development of these options. It's basically analyzing and summarizing all the qualitative and quantitative data to come up with options. We also want to be considerate of a couple of other things. We want to be considerate of not only our best practices and things that we may have done in other places, but also case law. And when we talk about case law, we really talk about a couple of things. There's obviously a very important Supreme Court decision that has to do with ward boundary reviews and the idea of effective representation. That's the Carter case. And a lot of the core principles we talk about stem from that case. But as well, there have been countless Ontario Municipal Board, now referred as LPAT, and I think this week the name just changed again. The name escapes me right now. It's a moving target, but there is a tribunal that looks at these matters as well. So all these bylaws that get passed, the ward boundary review bylaw that gets passed, can be appealed to LPAT, and based on those decisions, certain themes come from that. So obviously we take that into consideration as well. The last point I want to make is what Bob just touched on, even with regard to that optimum population. It's very difficult. It's almost impossible to have wards that are going to be all in that optimum population. It's very difficult, and again, almost impossible to have a ward system that is going to completely check all of the core principles. A lot of times it does become a little bit of a balancing act or a trade-off, if you will. Bob touched on one point a minute ago. Ward 1, largest population, largest geography. However, if we did something to, or we'll use another example. Typically, when we look at large areas, we would rather have a smaller population, recognizing that, the practicality and on the ground reality of the counselor doing that job has a large geographic area to cover. So again, a trade-off may be you have a large rural area. We want to recognize that. We want to recognize the practicality, like I said, of the counselor's job, but the trade-off might be you might not be able to have the population parity that you want in that area. So again, we try to check and meet the guiding principles in a uniform way as much as possible, but there's going to be, and we'll see this when we walk through the preliminary options, there's going to be cases where one guiding principle might be weighted, and again, not in any official sense, but might be weighted a little bit less compared to another guiding principle. If we move to the next slide, a couple of things just touching on what that alternative system might look like, and really going back to some of the things that Bob talked about in terms of feedback. When we look at what we heard, almost 50% of the survey respondents wanted a system that prioritized representation by population. When we look at future population or electoral trends, another 15%, it really tells us that almost 65% of the municipality's population wants a system that recognizes population both today and in the future as well. But like Bob said, it wasn't 0% for the other guiding principles. There were still almost a quarter that still wanted us to recognize communities of interest, and about 15% that wanted to ensure that those boundary lines are clean, identifiable, and used natural and man-made features. So again, just an idea of what we heard and what goes into some of our thinking for the preliminary options that we'll look at shortly. If we move to the next slide, we're going to finish off today just with a few next steps and a reminder of what the public can continue to do to provide us additional feedback. So right now, actually today, the preliminary options report was released on the municipality's website. So anyone that wants to go and get some more additional detail and more information can check out the preliminary options report. A lot of what we talked about in this presentation, as well as the actual options and commentary around those options are in there. Please continue to provide feedback. Participation has been great so far, and we hope that continues, especially in this most important part of the study where you actually get to look at the preliminary options and let us and council ultimately know what your preferences are. And like I talked about a little bit earlier, ultimately the next step now in July is going to be developing final recommendations and presenting those recommendations to the council. So to finish off tonight, if we move to the last slide, again, visit the webpage for the project. That is really the central warehouse. And then you see that at the top of the screen, Oro-Medonte, oro-medonte.ca /WBR. And really everything is there, whether it be historical reports, the new report I talked about today, surveys, FAQs, it's all really there. So as little and as much as you want to dive in, you can do so. Continue to ask questions. So please ask questions of us tonight. And we have another couple of sessions on Thursday afternoon at 3 and another one Thursday evening again at 7. Read the reports that I talked about and get informed and educated about this process. We feel that the more you know about the process, the better communication and input you can provide. Also on the website, there's an interactive mapping tool. So there's a little box on the website called mapping. And if you click on that, it brings you to a little tool that you can click and you can put in your address, find where you live, click on the different options, and you can see exactly how the lines change and how it impacts your ward and where you live. The survey we've spoken about a couple of times tonight. I often say, if you only do one thing to participate in this, please go to the survey and answer the survey questions. It really gives the consultant team a really consistent form of feedback. So again, if that's the only thing you do in this process, please answer the survey and get the word out. We really rely on residents to tell their friends, tell their families, tell their neighbors that this study is going on. It's an important study that's going to impact and affect the way that you elect future councils. So the more that you know and the more people that know about this, the more feedback and again, the better recommendations ultimately that will come to your council. So that's it in terms of the presentation portion of tonight. But like I said, we are going to move right into the preliminary options. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to give a quick description of each of the option. I'll introduce them, and then Bob will provide some of his expertise with regard to our thinking and some highlights of each option. And then after each option, we'll give anybody on the call a chance to provide any comments and questions if they wish. And then at the end of all the options presented, we'll allow for some feedback as well. Okay, we are back live. I hope everyone enjoyed and found that presentation informative. And hopefully it helped give a little bit of background to what we're about to get into with regard to the preliminary options. So I'm just going to give Josh a second to get sorted and get those options up. What we're going to do tonight, so like I said at the end of the presentation, so we're going to go through each option. We will explain them and give the public, if they so choose, a couple of some chances to provide some feedback, ask questions, or anything that they want clarified. As I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, if you want to ask questions through the chat feature, go ahead, type them in any time, and we'll address them. Or once I ask if there's any comments or questions, you can unmute yourself feel free to turn your video on as well if you're comfortable doing that, and we can listen that way. Before I get into the actual options, you see on your screen now just the guiding principles. So we talked about these principles that we use to help evaluate both the existing system as well as our options. So I don't want to get, I think we went through them, explained them. I'm not going to go into great detail, but just a quick reminder to jog your memory about some of the things that we try to keep in mind when we're looking at these options. If we move to the next slide, a little bit just the existing ward map that we showed you during the presentation. Again, just for some reference, as we start to look at some proposed new ward boundaries, hopefully this just helps provide a little bit of context for comparison purposes as to what our changes look like compared to the system that you have now. You can see the population table there at the bottom as well that we talked about in the presentation, which shows the existing population of your existing wards, both 2021 and 10 years forward in 2031. So if we move to the first option, so preliminary option one, and very quickly, we have 6 options that we're going to present tonight, 4 main ones, and then what we have sometimes what we call a B option. And the B option may have some similarities to the A option that we present. Perhaps a couple of lines move, but the overall theme of the option is the same. So it's not a completely reworked option, but like I said, it has some similarities to the A portion. It'll make a little bit more sense once we start going through the individual options. So preliminary option one, we call this option, or we tend to refer to some of these options as a minimal disruption option. So we talked in the presentation earlier tonight about some issues and some things that we found deficient in the existing system. But we were clear that we didn't think the system needed necessarily a complete overhaul, that it would be possible to fix a couple of the things that we identified with some maybe leaning towards more of minor changes. So, and this system, you can see some familiarity with the existing system. However, there's a couple of fairly big differences. And the one that I think you'll notice when you look at the map is that the horseshoe ward is contained within its own ward now. So that ward 3 in orange in the middle is one ward horseshoe completely contained within it. To do that, though, you see a couple of changes in the bottom portion of the municipality as well, where your existing system basically has 3 wards that divide up the southern portion of the municipality. This option has 2 wards. From a population parity perspective, if you look at the bottom chart, pretty good population parity, at least in 4 of the 5 wards, all within that acceptable range in 2021. However, you'll notice that that horseshoe ward that I spoke about, Ward 3, is at about 42% of the optimum population. So well below what we really want, what we explained in the presentation, that 25% variance. However, if you look at the 2031 population, you see that that ward basically grows into population parity, but in the short term, it is definitely on the low side in terms of population. Bob, some other things to add here?
Couple of things further to add, Jack. I'll just make the general point that we will return to is that once we make a certain decision about how to approach the distribution of population and the communities, other things have to be adjusted to work around that. This model assumes that Horseshoe Valley, both north and south of Horseshoe Valley Road, belong in a single ward as the growth is going to happen primarily there. Once we do that, though, other things have to be fitted around it. Though one of the main ones is that, of course, in the current system, there are 3 wards that are primarily south of Horseshoe Valley Road. In this case, of course, there are only 2, and that's because we had to fit in this extra ward. So we need to look as we go through these at how that part of the south is handled. The interesting part here, of course, is that the 2 wards on the east side are very similar to the present wards, except they're actually a bit wider, if you will. They run a little further east, again, to accommodate that area in the south. The other theme to look for as we move through this is there's 2 more. One is where Craighurst is located. It's a growing community, not as large as Horseshoe Valley, but still large enough, not large enough to be its own ward. So then the question is, where do we align it? In some of the options, it is like this, where we align it with the north. In another couple of cases, we will see it aligned with the center part of the township, and in another case, all the way south, as in the current structure. So that little shoulder, if you will, is an important part of how the ripple effects are found once certain decisions are made. And the last part, just to not to dwell on it too much longer, but of course Ward 3, if you go back when you can and look at the current boundary, you'll see that the western boundary of that, what is then Ward 1, follows an irregular line. And what we try to do in all of these is to create clean, straight lines where we can. So those are themes that we pick up in the first map. Yes, there's the existing one with that odd line that in fact separates parts of the Horseshoe Valley community from one another. So we try to get rid of that, try to smooth out the lines where we can elsewhere. And then, as I said, certain kinds of things flow on from there. Back to you, Jack.
Great, Bob. Thank you. Any questions from our participants on the Zoom call? Any comments that you want to talk about with regard to option one? Okay, we're going to keep going through, but as I mentioned, if anything comes up, just raise your hand. We'll call on you or use the chat feature and you can ask us something anytime. So moving into option 2A, and this is what I spoke about earlier. So in option 2, we have an A version and a B version, and we'll talk in a second about how those options change. But focusing on option 2A for a second, a couple of things I'll highlight. So still a 5-ward option. We talked in the option 1 how we tried to build a ward around Horseshoe Valley and keep it contained within 1 ward. But we also talked about some of the issues that presents, especially from a short-term population perspective. So in this option, we tried to mainly address that to start with. And as Bob said, to see how things fit around or build around that assumption. So obviously you can see from a population parity perspective, we don't have that very low ward that showed up in the bright red, which we typically don't want. Here we have most of the wards, again, in pretty good population parity with each other. There's a couple of ones that I'll point out because we do see a couple of bright red blocks again. So Ward 5 is a little bit above our ideal or acceptable range, but not well above. It's just slightly above in the short term. And we see that again, as the municipality grows, that ward comes into population parity. On the opposite end, we look at Ward 1, well within our acceptable range in 2021, but because that population is staying largely stable, as the rest of the municipality's population grows, that ward falls a little bit below our optimum range, but again, not vastly below. It's about 71%, and our bottom of the range we like at about 75%. So a couple of wards in each of the periods, slightly above and below, but pretty decent population parity here. And again, like I said at the beginning, it addresses that significant population disparity in the short term by having Horseshoe in 1 ward. Bob?
Well, again, there are things that are similar to the current system. And in this instance, it's the proposed Ward 4, which is that starting at Craighurst and running down to the lake in this instance, moving a little further east. But to do that, we ended up turning the remaining part of the lakeshore, if you will, on its side and creating an east-west ward that picks up the rest of the lakefront. And at the north side, again, Highway 400 is a common boundary we now use, I think, in all of the wards that involve either Horseshoe Valley or Horseshoe Valley and Sugarbush. It means that the North Ward, which in the current system crosses Highway 400 to go south, in this case, it crosses it to go east over toward Warminster. And that is, as we see in the chart there, a low population ward because a lot of that is area that is not really open to agriculture in a traditional sense. It's not likely to see any significant development. So it is a relatively sparsely populated area, not quite as large perhaps as Ward 4, but it's turning that area north of Highway 400 across to the east rather than straight south.
Thanks, Bob. Any questions with regard to option 2A? Oh, just really quickly, and I apologize if I missed this, but I just on option 2A, just because I want to touch on one of the differences between 2A and 2B. If you look at the line between wards 2 and 1, we use Warminster Side Road as a boundary. So it provides a fairly clean, identifiable, fairly major road as that boundary. However, one thing you notice is that it does divide that community of Warminster. So that is one of the things that we want to get feedback on, or what we try to understand. Is it more important to have a clean, identifiable boundary line where everybody knows where the ward begins and ends? Or in this case, do we not want to see Warminster divided? And would it be more important to have Warminster kept in one ward? And we'll see exactly what that means when we look at option 2B. So just before I move on to option 2B, I see that George has his hand up. So George, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question or make your comment, feel free. And if you're having some issues, I don't know if you look on the bottom left of your screen, there should be a mute and a little video icon there. And if you click that, that should be able to unmute yourself. Okay, we're just gonna move on and see if George figures it out. And if you do, George, just go ahead and interrupt us. Okay, so we're going to move on to option 2B. So option 2B, like I said, one of these B options that we talked about. And so there's definitely some similarities to what we just spoke about in 2A, but I want to highlight a few, probably three of the main differences between 2A and 2B. So the first one is what I just spoke about. It's that Warminster area where we had used the side road as a boundary, however, identified that it does divide that community up. So in this option, if you look at that line, it actually keeps Warminster all in one ward in this option, and the boundary line follows the southern portion of the settlement boundary line. The other change that is made is what Bob was speaking about with regard to Craighurst. So in option 2A, we see that it is associated similarly to the existing system with the area south. And this one, similar to a couple of the other options we looked at, it's brought north again. So that's the other change. And then if you look at the southeast portion of the map of the municipality, you'll see that the area between wards 2 and ward 5, you see that it east of line, I believe it's I can't see it because my eyes are not very good anymore. I think it's 14 South. 14. Yeah. East of there, that boundary line is now pushed south all the way to Lake Simcoe. So those are the three major changes. As a result of that, you get a couple, Ward 5 becomes a little bit more compact. Ward 4 becomes a little bit more compact because Craighurst is now pushed north. From a population parity perspective, again, a little bit better than what we saw in option 2A. All the wards, I believe, are in the optimum range. So again, from a population parity perspective, it works quite well. Bob, some other things to add here?
Well, again, it's when you make one change, others seem to fall. There's a bit of a domino effect. If we make an adjustment, in this case, I think we keep the proposed Ward 3 identical from 2A, and other changes flow on from there. The idea of connecting Craighurst to the north, as I said, is part of that first option. It helps create some population parity. The other part then is, I think that's more significant, is that line between wards 1 and 2, which, as we said, it is a significant roadway, Warminster Side Road. It's not a straight line because the road itself jogs. And some might say, well, why don't you just create a straight line and be done with it? Part of this issue is that the lines need to be identifiable. from our point of view. You need to know, well, am I in one ward or another? And on many of the current boundaries actually follow property lines rather than roadways, and so that is part of the ambiguity that creates some complications at times for a clean map and for clearly understanding the system. This is an approach then that is aimed at quite a good population balance over time. But as I said, it's moving one part creates some other ripples. In this case, the center stays the same and things are moved around the outside in slightly different ways by taking Craighurst out of the proposed Ward 4 and putting it in the north, and then it goes around from there.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, we tend to use the whack-a-mole analogy when we talk about moving some of these lines around, and we see an issue, we think we have it fixed, a big eureka moment, and we've whacked that mole down, and then another one pops up, and we think, oh, how are we going to fix this one now too? So it really becomes a you're chasing your tail sometimes, trying to fix all the different issues that pop up when you start moving some of these boundaries around. Any questions, comments with regard to what we just looked at in 2B? Okay, we're going to keep moving along. So we're moving to preliminary option 3. So still looking at a 5-ward system. And when we look at 3B, definitely some similarities to what we just talked about in 2B. In fact, wards 1 and wards 2 in this option, aside from a little triangle, I think, in the northern part of Ward 2 by the Highway 400, pretty much identical to what we looked at in option 2B. Some similarities to options 4 or wards 4 and 5 as well, but really the main difference in this one is how we look at the central part of the municipality. And we see, similar to one other option we looked at already tonight, a fairly large central ward that really runs the east-west course of the municipality. In this section, it goes from side road 1516 east, and on the eastern half of the municipality all the way up to Warminster. So fairly large ward in terms of geography. However, to get the population parity that we're looking for, that's kind of the trade-off is we do have to have a pretty expansive ward there. From a population parity perspective, all the wards, both in 2021 and 2031, all in the acceptable range. In 2021, wards 4 and 5 are pretty much perfect. Ward 4, bang on the optimum range. Ward 5, just a couple of percent off the optimum range. So again, we think this is a well-balanced approach when we look at the guiding principles. It reflects most of the communities of interest, good population parity, but I think one trade-off is some wards have some expansive geography. Bob?
Again, in this scenario, we've grouped Sugar Bush with Horseshoe Valley. That tends to start at a relatively low population, but grows into a plausible scenario. But each time you make those moves, other things have to be adjusted. I think the one distinctive part of this is that proposed Ward 3, which essentially follows the old Berry Road corridor, which would be I guess a different way of thinking about the township, where at the moment the boundaries tend to run north and south. This is actually deliberately following what I would call an east-west corridor. And again, the question of getting to enough population rather than, if you will, borrowing it from areas in the south where there are not a lot of obvious lines to use. We've ended up taking part of the east side up toward Warminster and capturing those areas in there up through Price's Corners. The other part of that, of course, is that by keeping Old Berry Road as a continuous part, some of the settlements along there are not divided. They are represented within that single ward. The northern one, though, again, is much like I guess it's option 1. Sorry, option, get it right here, 2B, where we've taken the north from Craigminster around to Warminster to circle that growth area in the proposed Ward 2.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Any comments, any questions with regard to preliminary option 3? George, go ahead.
Okay, I think I have it this time.
We hear you loud and clear.
Okay. The comment I was trying to make was, and I think you mentioned it in your last option near the end, where you kind of said you take the whack-a-mole thing and you move your boundaries by drastic amounts. The one thing I had noticed and I was wondering was if you take, I think was your option 1, and instead of moving all the other boundaries around, that you just added the sugar bush area like you did on the next option, if I'm not mistaken, and that how your population breakdown would come out, because it looks like looking at some of the numbers that may correct itself.
Yeah, so absolutely, you are correct in some of the assumptions that you're making. But what we're trying to do is show in option 1. So I guess going back to the guiding principles and a little bit of the whack-a-mole analogy and some of the trade-offs or prioritizations we have to make. So we're deliberately trying to show an example in option 1 that recognizes that the population distribution is not going to be ideal in the short term, but it also recognizes that Horseshoe Valley is a community of interest. It has a significant amount of population now, and more importantly, it has a population that's expected to more than double because of the growth occurring in that area. So you're right. I mean, moving that area over and incorporating a sugar bush would fix that short-term population parity issue. But we try to show that in some of the other preliminary options. For example, what Josh just brought up now in 2A, and then even taking it a step further in 2B, it's going back to what Bob said is, okay, if we like some of the elements in 1, but we don't like Horseshoe on its own, we look at 2B. However, if we don't like how Craighurst is situated in 2A, then we look at 2B. So we're trying to provide options that tend to give you some different issues to think about. And ultimately, what we're going to do is take that feedback, take these options, and try to give your council a couple of final recommendations that address all of these. So what they might get is one that says, hey, council, here's one that looks at Horseshoe Valley contained within its own ward, but here's the implications and trade-offs that and Bob puts it well, I think. He says, this is basically a package. It's not going to be perfect. It's really difficult, as we've talked about, to find a ward system that's going to completely check all the boxes and have perfect population parity. But you're basically trying to buy a package and saying, okay, if I buy this package with Horseshoe in its own ward, I know that I'm not getting the population parity I want, at least in the short term, but I'm getting all these other things. If, however, let's say the other option we present to council says, okay, park that idea, but what if we can't accept Horseshoe in one ward because of that population disparity? Here's another one that says, okay, it combines Horseshoe with something else. We have better population parity as a whole, both today and in the future. So I hope that wasn't too long of a way of trying to explain how we try to balance different guiding principles, and we try to provide options that focus a little bit more perhaps on some of the different guiding principles. Bob, some other things to add to that?
Yeah, the point I would make is that it's not as simple as saying, well, let's just move one line and everything else falls into place. We need to look at those implications, and that's where feedback from you, George, and anyone else who's joining in will help us rethink some of the ways these are put together. Again, keeping in mind that there are 5 principles, not just strictly population. So working that together, and I think the story too is that one of the reasons we haven't moved that area to the west is that the Craighurst community would be too large to join with Horseshoe Valley for various reasons, and maybe Sugar Bush is a better fit, but maybe it shouldn't be a fit at all. And that's why we want to just look at what it means if you do it in one way as opposed to another way. There's no single right answer. Different ways to do it will bring you different kinds of, I won't say different results. That's obviously the map is different, but carry other kinds of things along with a choice of that sort.
Yeah. But ultimately, it's those kind of comments that we want to hear, right? If residents and ultimately council that makes the decision, but if they think, no, I don't like that. I don't think that that should be contained in one ward. And I think it fits better over here. Or I think how you guys have grouped this. No. I think this works better over here. That feedback, like Bob said, is going to help us refine these preliminary options and actually develop something final that hopefully is viable for your council.
And if I can just quickly, Jack, on a smaller scale, let's call it the Warminster component is interesting. Does Warminster go with a ward to the north with a somewhat irregular line drawn around the settlement area, which is not something that's easily visible and may in fact be modified if growth goes on, or should it be with the south where you draw the line on the other side, or should you draw the line right through the middle? Those are each components that flow into the population numbers, the connections between and among the parts of a particular ward. And all we can do is say, if you do it this way, this might happen. If you do it the other way, something else happens. Please, people in the community, give us some thoughts about how it appears to you, especially if you live there.
Exactly.
Can I make one other observation?
Please.
When it comes to Craighurst and Horseshoe Valley, although their populations are causing a problem, but I believe they are a community that will be using shared services in some cases, if I'm not mistaken.
So we
water and wastewater potentially.
Yeah, that actually came up the other night, and we had a little discussion about it with the municipality's planning department and planner. And according to the information we have, it should be on separate services. So each development will have its own servicing, we believe. So that's something that definitely came up, but thank you for bringing that up. And even just, we have played around with that horseshoe Craighurst that Bob said, that Bob talked about. And there's some options that, maybe can possibly make it work from a population parity perspective in the short term. But as we talked about, Horseshoe Valley's population is expected to more than double. And I think Craighurst's population is 5-6 times what it is today in the next 10, 11 years. So when you start to factor in the growth in those individual communities, it really becomes untenable when we start to look forward.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, George. Appreciate the feedback and the comments. Any other questions? Any other comments that maybe something got jogged from that last discussion? Okay. So at this stage, we're going to move into preliminary option 4A and 4B, and those are our last two preliminary options. But I just want to take a pause for a second because I want to talk a little bit about some of the implications of these last two options. So we've spoken about the existing system. The municipality currently has a 5-ward system. One local councillor represents each ward. You have a deputy mayor and a mayor elected at large. As our scope and our mandate was not only ward boundary review, but we were also asked to look at council composition and the size of the council. And Bob talked a little bit about feedback received, and a little more than half of the survey respondents thought council size was just right the way it was. About a third thought that an increase in council size might be warranted, and obviously a lot less than that, or a little bit less than that, thought that council size should be smaller as well. So really what we're doing in 4A and 4B is we're building off the idea that we heard from about a third of residents that we should explore a larger council. In addition, we spoke about these systems being evaluated against the guiding principles, and we highlighted a couple of concerns that pop up when we're dealing with a 5-ward system. Some of the ones that come to mind right off top of my head is some of the large size of the wards that we spoke about. So obviously, if you go smaller than that, your wards get larger. So if you add a ward, you might have some flexibility and ability to make some of those wards more compact. Like I said, these next two options look at 6-ward options. So we're adding 1 ward, obviously 1 local councillor to these proposed systems. Obviously, there are some implications that come with increasing council size. And so we just want to take a couple of minutes before we get into the actual options, just to talk about a couple of those implications. So obviously, if you go bigger, you have to pay an additional counselor. So there's some remuneration impacts to increasing council size from a salary perspective, from an expense perspective. There may be additional resources required for an additional counselor, office space, furniture, all of those things have to be considered. So again, we want to be clear to the public and ultimately to council that with this proposal, there are some added expenditures associated with it. The other thing that has come up when we look at this proposal is if you maintain, like we talked about, the existing structure of council with a mayor and a deputy mayor and the existing 5 councilors, if you add one, you get to a council size of 8. And we've heard not only in this ward boundary review, but in many other reviews that Bob and I do, that there is sometimes a concern, I think is the best way to put it, about an even numbered council. So I'm going to pass things over to Bob, and Bob's going to give a little bit of perspective, pros and cons of an even numbered council, and a couple of examples of, because it does exist in Ontario, it's not a unicorn. So a few examples of where it exists and where it seems to work well. Bob?
Yes, thank you, Jack. As anyone who's looked through our reports will find out from time to time, we keep pointing out that a lot of the things we're dealing with are not covered under provincial legislation or under any regulations. That goes for how a board boundary review is conducted, for how many wards, all those kinds of things. And the question of an odd or even sized council is another one of those. There are no rules that you must have an odd number or that you may have an even number. There's simply nothing said about it. So it's really a matter of convention, practice, what people are familiar with. And for many people, the idea that there should be an odd number is seen as a way to avoid deadlock. And votes that, in this case, if we were talking about 8 members, votes that were continually coming in at 4 to 4 would really deadlock a lot of business that the council is trying to conduct. And so some people say, well, we shouldn't let that happen. We should guarantee we have an odd number. But there are also cases, of course, where even if you have an odd number, from time to time, members of council are not available for a meeting. Maybe it doesn't happen very often, but illness can happen, various other reasons why people can't participate. So you're back to an odd number. And even with a conflict of interest requirements, an odd number will occur. Of course, the reverse can happen. You have an odd number and somebody's away and you're back to an even number. So it's not something that's going to necessarily happen, but to say that the system needs to build that in is probably not a crucial factor, especially if we can accomplish other kinds of things. And the other theme in there is basically making it work. The members of council, however many of them there are, presumably have a responsibility to help make decisions for the municipality. And if things are constantly turning up in a deadlock, then there's more at stake here than the words themselves. There's more to it than the structure you're using. Now, we will say that out of roughly 400 municipalities in Ontario, about 50, the number is a bit unclear for the moment, but roughly 40 to 50 have an even number. And I would suspect that very few of them are experiencing this kind of deadlock syndrome on a regular basis. Once in a while, maybe you could live with that. Even large cities, Ottawa and Hamilton, the 2 largest cities in Ontario outside of Toronto, have an even numbered council. So it's not something that's unknown and is a widespread practice in municipalities, small and large. My view at the moment is that should not preclude adding another counselor, leaving aside the cost question, if it helps improve representation. That's my take on it. Again, council does not have guidance to follow. It's what you're comfortable with. If what you believe you can accomplish by adding a seat, my personal perspective would be that you can learn to live with that possibility, and you shouldn't throw the whole thing out just for that reason.
Thanks, Bob. So before we get into the options, one last theme I want to explore, only because we raised this a little bit in our preliminary options report. So what we talk about is really just building off Bob's last point. If there is an unwillingness to increase council size, however, there is a willingness to see more than the 5 wards, there is another possibility that could be available to the municipality, and that has to deal with how the deputy mayor position is treated or elected. So right now, as I talked about, your deputy mayor is elected as a separate position that's elected by general vote at large. And in many other municipalities, they have a deputy mayor that is selected from amongst the elected councillors. So what that means is that, let's suppose that you have a 6-ward system and the deputy mayor position still exists, but not elected at large. The council themselves would select the deputy mayor position from one of the 6 locally elected councillors. So it removes that position away from a general elected position into a selection by your peers on council. So there are, like I said, there are other municipalities that do this. It's a little bit gray and a little bit muddled in Simcoe County because of some different pieces of legislation. So the Municipal Act gives councils the authority to do what we're talking about, to change the way the deputy mayor position is elected or selected. However, there is some legislation in Simcoe County, and Bob will talk a little bit about this in more detail in a second, but there's a piece of legislation that says the municipalities must be represented on county council by the mayor and deputy mayor, both of which should be elected at large. So I'm going to pass things over to Bob because he can give some more detailed opinions and perspectives on what we think about the legislation and that little piece about the deputy mayor, and maybe a little bit about too, for some context about what the county has gone through over the last year and why this is a little bit more of an issue than it may be.
All right, thanks, Jack. Yes, I believe that the idea of doing a council composition review had a lot of momentum when the county of Simcoe was reviewing the composition of its council, which at that point, I think it was 32 people, the largest municipal council in Ontario, an upper tier. And there was some discussion about the possibility of reducing the representation from 2 members per municipality to 1, which would have meant the position of deputy mayor was not needed to play that role. And that's what the County of Simcoe Act says. There will be 2, but there was discussion about making that possibility, to changing that so that there was only 1. So we were thinking about that as we moved along through this exercise. As Jack suggested, though, the Act talks about 2, but there are other parts of that Act that have now been modified. For example, and I reviewed it not long ago, Midland, and I certainly Midland was described as having a council elected in wards, but they've changed away from wards to have a general, an at-large election. That did not require an amendment to the County of Simcoe Act, partly because the act has been repealed. So there's no act to change. So they worked under the provisions of the Municipal Act, which is what could apply here. It's still a bit gray. Did that act basically mean nothing could ever change? And I don't believe that that's the way it would work. So let me back out of where I was there. The County of Simcoe Act calls for 2 positions, and 2 general elected by general vote. The provincial legislation, Municipal Act, allows that to change. And as Jack said, there are different models, like we talked about a moment ago. In some municipalities, the deputy mayor position is filled by a separate election, which would be one of the 7 here, or is filled by selecting someone already on council. Pros and cons. A general election, everybody gets to vote for it, but on that basis, if you want the job, you've got to campaign across the whole municipality, got to get out and win votes and conduct a different kind of campaign than you would if you were running in a ward. And that could be seen as a a detrimental factor. It would be a possible limitation on many candidates. The flip side, of course, is that if you do away with that, the only people who could ever serve as deputy mayor would be the ward councilors, one of those people. So instead of it being wide open, the pool of candidates is limited to, in this case, it would be 6. And for some people, that's not desirable. Again, the practices vary. In Simcoe County, yes, they're all elected at large, but in other municipalities around Ontario, the choice is made from within council. And so we believe that that is open. Now, the end of this story, if you will, I'll try to be quick, is that Simcoe County is not making that change. So there will still be 2 representatives. However, in our view, if council is persuaded that 6 wards can serve the issue of representation better, but there is no appetite to go to an 8th position, we believe that that is still within their authority to enact.
Great. Thank you, Bob. And I hope that, again, a little bit long-winded from both of us, but we really wanted to ensure that all the implications are out there and that residents and council is aware if they moved and selected one of these proposed 6 ward systems, what the different sort of options around those were. So going into preliminary option 4A, so this is the first 6 ward system that we're looking at. A couple of things I'll quickly point out. So definitely some similarities to some of the other options that we've looked at so far tonight. Definitely borrowed from a few of those other ideas. You see some similarities with that Ward 3. Starts at Craighurst, goes south, runs all the way west and east to the municipality through the municipality. With the additional ward, what you'll see is what I referenced earlier. The wards, with the exception of Ward 3 that I spoke about, become a little bit more compact and the geography not quite as expansive as in some of the other options, especially when we look at the northern wards and that combination of wards 1, 2, and 4. From a population parity perspective, we get very good population parity in the short term with all 6 wards in 2021 within our acceptable range. In the long term, a little bit outside of our acceptable range, but not very much. In Ward 1, similar to a couple of other options we looked at, as the municipality starts to grow, Ward 1 a little bit on the low end of our acceptable range. Ward 2, again, with that Horseshoe Valley growth coming on, slightly, but only about 2% above our acceptable range, but slightly above that acceptable range. Bob?
So in this scenario, the earlier version of an east-west ward, as in option 3, is narrower. It's not as large a territory. And instead of going up to the north on the east side, it goes across and takes in Craighurst as a connection. And that is if you will, a connection that's already there in the current system. This one happens to cut it off above, I guess it's side road, side road 15, 16. So it's not quite as long, but it's an attempt to work across that Old Barry Road corridor. We've got a narrower range in the south, similar though to the versions we saw in earlier options, keeping the lake area in 2 wards rather than 3. Very much, I guess, like option 3 there, the area gets divided in only one line and it's a clean line. And the north, as you just said, Jack, is really not a place where there's significant growth anticipated. So it's not that it suddenly drops down by losing population. It's everyone else grows and its relative position changes. It's not a serious defect compared to where we might be if it was actually losing population. But again, it's a coherent connection, much like we find in our option 2A, where it's the north, and Moonstone and Warminster are both in that ward.
Thanks, Bob. So our final, any comments, questions about 4A? Okay, so we're going to move to our final option. It's also our second B option that I referred to. So it's a B option because it has some similarities to our 4A option, but largely because it's our other 6 ward option. So again, a couple of the things I'll highlight. You'll see going back, if we can remember our option one and what George asked about, the Horseshoe Valley contained on its own. So we bring that idea back in this 6th ward option. What we have are the same issues that we have when we had Horseshoe Valley and one ward in option one. We have a population disparity for that ward, and you see it, it's a little bit better, but we see it at about half of what we want in terms of our acceptable population ranges. The other 5 wards are all in the acceptable range. However, if you focus on the 2031 populations, as Horseshoe Valley's population grows out, and we see what happens with the other wards, we actually have 4 of the 6 wards in the optimum range. And Bob talked a little bit about earlier in the presentation how it's very rare that we're ever going to, getting 6 in the optimum is probably impossible. But even in our experience, getting 4, 3 or 4, or the majority of the wards in that optimum becomes very difficult when you try to balance all of the other guiding principles that we spoke about. So again, when we look at this option from a 2031 population, probably one of the best, or at least better, population parity examples we've devised so far in the course of doing these reviews. But again, obviously that deficiency in this one is you'd have to put up with the lower population in the short term. The other thing before I pass things over to Bob that I want to talk about as well when we're talking about that lower population is one thing we hear from counselors is when you're dealing with a ward that has significant population projected, that in and of itself is a responsibility that counselor has to deal with. So we're also trying to be cognizant of that fact in some of these options that look at Horseshoe on its own. It may be that, yes, the population is lower in the short term compared to some of the other areas. But again, recognizing the fact that counselor may have to deal with developers and subdivision applications and new residents moving into new units and some of the extra responsibility that incurs. We just wanted to point that out. Bob, some final comments on the last option?
Yeah, we have from time to time heard people ask, well, what have you taken into account counselor workload? And that's really what we're looking at here. But the interesting point is the workload is of not of a different kind, but it had to be addressed in a different way. So Ward 2 is very small, Ward 4 is very large geographically, but they're not necessarily all that different when it comes to the workload. One has to travel a long way to get to all parts of the ward. The other doesn't have to. And the other part of this one, which it's not necessarily a defect in one sense, but looking at the map, one would say, oh, that's a bit odd to have a horseshoe around Horseshoe Valley with that Ward 3 that picks up both sides. But again, it's not unrelated to George's comments and others that Horseshoe by itself is going to grow enormously. So why don't we pick up the other 2 areas, the other 2 populations clusters in that area just south of 400 and put them together? Well, to do that, we don't leave them in 2 separate wards and or the same ward in 2 parts. That would be inappropriate. So we have to group them together. And again, it's the same story that if we were to say, let's keep it smaller, then the ripple effect is that Ward 5 becomes bigger. And that's not a suitable solution to address that problem. So on a couple of levels, it may look odd, but as Jack has said, to get to population parity in 2031, this is an enormously successful scenario to allow that to happen. So again, it's which of those principles takes precedent: population parity in the longer term, and pretty good parity in the short term is a good combination.
Great, thank you, Bob. So those are the preliminary award options we've presented so far. We do stress the term preliminary because we do want to get feedback to help us refine these options. To that end, are there any final comments or questions or anything people on the call think that we should know about? Okay. And please, if you think of anything, feel free to interrupt me while I make some closing remarks. So I just want to start out by again thanking all the participants, both those who took time on the call, those who provided feedback, and all those watching on the live stream as well. We really do appreciate you taking the time. We do think that it provides a lot of value ultimately to this project and to the recommendations the consultants are going to present to your council. On that last point, so the next couple of steps, we talked about a few of these at the end of the presentation, but just a quick reminder to everybody that the survey is going to be open for another week. In addition, Josh just brought up the municipality's ward boundary review webpage. So I mentioned the address earlier, oro-medonte.ca/WBR. If you go to this webpage, you can find a bunch of different resources that we spoke about earlier, the different reports, the survey that we spoke about. There's videos that you can watch. There's FAQs. There's some mapping that you can go and check out. So it's very easy, very user-friendly, easy to understand when you start to navigate through the different sections on here. Tonight was the last of our public information sessions. But they are going to be put up on the website. So if you want to go back and take a look at them, or if you want to let people know that they're on there, that'd be a great way to learn a little bit more about the project as well. The final report and recommendations is coming back to your council at a meeting in July. And that's where they will have the opportunity then to hear about what we talked about, to hear about what the public said, and ultimately to hear about some final recommendations from the consultant team. So again, thank you very much. We hope you continue to engage with us in this process, and we hope that you found tonight's session informative. Have a wonderful night. Good night.